Starting off, since I'm an economist and I don't entirely know my audience, let me just go through a little bit of terminology here so that we're all on the same page. I will use the term cost effectiveness somewhat generically in this talk, but actually there's a sort of a technical jargon that's used in the field. Cost effectiveness analysis, usually we're talking about cost relative to some sort of a clinical outcome. It might be a DAS-28 score, a SHARP score, whatever it is, whatever clinical measure it is that you really want to try to follow. Cost utility analysis is a somewhat more refined version of that. Here we're talking about the cost relative to the patient's quality of life. And it's usually measured with a score. A QALY is the typical metric, the quality adjusted life year. I'll have more to say about that as I go. And then there's another term which we bandy about, which is called cost benefit analysis. And that's where we try to give a monetary value, such as willingness to pay, to the benefit of treatment, and then compare it to the cost. Cost-benefit studies are pretty rare in the field of rheumatology because it's really hard to try to put a number on sort of how the patients feel and how they're responding. But that is the terminology that's out there. We frequently in this work use what's called the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio. And that typically compares the cost, the change in cost, between drug A relative to drug B. Now you notice on the slide this blank area here. In economics, we believe in the important power of the invisible hand, right? Market forces at work will bring about an optimal social solution. What we have here is the invisible equation, because despite several efforts that I've had with the technical folks here, I originally made this slide in Microsoft PowerPoint using the math terminology, and we haven't been able to make the equation come up. So this is where you're going to have to use a little bit of imagination here. The incremental cost effectiveness ratio, the ICER, is a number which is a ratio. The numerator would be the difference in cost between drug A and drug B. And then the denominator would be the difference in some effect between drug A and drug B. So difference in cost relative to difference in effect. Someday we'll get this to actually appear, but you can all imagine this with me. That's the invisible equation. And I'll have more to say about that in the future, but it's generally the ICER is the thing that is looked at by those who do cost effectiveness or cost utility evaluations. Once again, the denominator here could be either a clinical measure, in which case we're going to be talking technically about cost effectiveness, or the denominator could be something like quality adjusted life years. There's also comparative effectiveness analysis. And this is basically a measure of how well different treatments work, emphasizing all sorts of things, but the patient's perspective and desires are very important. And in the US, under current law, the PCORI, the Patient Clinical Effectiveness Institute, they are forbidden to think anything about monetary issues. In the UK or in Europe, Australia, they're much more willing to deal with the economic issues. But in the US, when we talk about comparative effectiveness analysis, we basically want to know what works clinically, what works from the patient perspective without worrying about the money at all. Okay, editorial a few years ago, 2012, made the remark that there's no doubt right now that biological DMARDs have shown efficacy and good safety. This applies to TNF inhibitors, IL-6 inhibitors, cell-targeting biologics, and so forth. The key point, the editorial writers say, is that these biologics are really expensive, and because of price, not all patients can be given these drugs And in general, only those with more severe and aggressive disease will receive such therapies. And we've seen today some examples of this from some of our speakers in terms of access to the drug in the European context and the price of the drug in the US context. Consumers Reports, I think the ultimate authority for many people on what drug to use and when to use it. Biologic, their report in 2013, biologics are seen as a significant advancement over other drugs used to treat rheumatoid arthritis, and all of them are very expensive. So Consumers Reports then went off to say, take it slow before you leap into this thing. So we can expect that if biosimilars become available at substantially lower prices than originator drugs, there may be very great changes in which drugs are used to treat rheumatoid arthritis and when they are used. So we've had already the talk from various folks this morning about the Northwich trial. Very interesting commentary upon what at least some evidence that one can easily substitute between the two, the originator and the biosimilar without having anything too bad happen, and actually have things work very well. And then, of course, we had the notice this week that Pfizer plans to actually market its biosimilar, assuming that it can get past all the lawyers that are going to stand in the way of making that happen. So what we think is going to happen in the market is that we should see, we hope, lower prices for the biosimilars than for the originators, although it's probably not going to be as dramatic as the generics versus the brand names, simply because it's expensive to develop the biosimilar, and all of the biosimilars are going to be a little bit different from each other, and this may lead to some market differentiation, which I'll have a little more to say about in a moment. We should see, as biosimilars come onto the market, less step therapy, because given that step therapy is often a requirement of insurers rather than necessarily physicians, we'll see more switching and substitution between the two, the biosimilars and the originators. We hope to see a reduction in other direct medical costs, such as hospital, home health, emergency department, outpatient visits, and what have you. And I'll have a little more to say about that on a study that my colleagues have recently done using some data from Corrona. This should result in reduced societal costs, lost work and disability, and longer periods of improved quality of life due to earlier access to the preferred treatment. There are some research challenges that face people like me who are the economists who are going to go off and do these studies. One is the problem of name confusion. We've had a few remarks about that this morning. The idea that the biosimilars are going to be designated with this random four-letter name attached to the scientific name. We have some concerns as economists about will this differentiation, how apparent will it be to those who prescribe the drug and to those who take the drug? If they can see that difference, there might be some niches created in the market where folks will say, well, you know, I need drug A, XYZZ, as opposed to drug A, ABCD, just because of the perception and perhaps the reality that there are some actual differences between the drug. To the extent that this is all masked, but in the information that's available to us, in either the way the Medicare comes out with its J codes for coding drugs, there might not be awareness in the market of differences between biosimilars and originators, and this would therefore tend to make it probably more likely that we would see substitution among the products. Another issue that is a research challenge will be being very careful about understanding reasons for prescribing and switching and keeping track of what those are. We also will have some challenges in measuring the quality of life and some challenges on price information and costs. And let me go into this a little bit more. I've mentioned the name confusion issue. Oops, how do I go back? Like that. So there are the four-letter suffixes, there are the J codes. What I think is really interesting is whether or not those of us who do research in this area will actually be able to track through some sort of data system information on exactly what was the drug that was being used. Will we be able to find this in clinical records? Will we be able to find it in claims data? You know, my car has on it a VIN number, as does yours, and that VIN number, that thing, is supposed to be able to tell me exactly what the car is, every major component in it, when it was manufactured, all that sort of stuff. We don't seem to have at the moment VIN numbers for drugs. And from a research perspective, this is something we'd really like to be able to keep track of, rather than trying to sort of guess what might be going on here through the other coding systems. We also want to be able to keep track of reasons for prescribing and switching. Was it inadequate response? Was there no response, too little response? Were there adverse events? Or is it just that what we're seeing is some sort of peer practice and mimicking of colleagues? We know from a lot of different kinds of clinical studies that physicians tend to be influenced by their colleagues, by their training. There have been any number of studies that have looked at differences in medical practice across different regions of the country. You sort of wonder, when you see a trend in prescribing drugs, is this really because of clinical considerations? Or, well, hey, your colleagues are using this particular drug and it seems to be working, so I'll prescribe it also. This introduces also a very interesting source of variation in practice that to a researcher is quite interesting. Joel, you mentioned just briefly this morning the idea that maybe you could use a registry like Corrona for purposes of randomly assigning people to something or other. And I think that's probably not what you ever want to do with a registry. With a registry, you just want to keep track of the folks. The thing we like to do as econometricians, as we go and play with the data, is to think of the physician as being a random number generator. That is, in the way we go about doing the statistical analysis, we can say, oh, okay, for whatever reason, Doc A prescribes this way, and for whatever reason, Doc B prescribes that way, and we can use some fancy statistical methods to sort of sort out the idea that the randomization is actually coming at the level of the physician or the practice or the region or the insurance company or what have you. Those things are at work there. And so we use methods, propensity scores or instrumental variables are the two techniques that we like to play with in econometrics to try to sort all that out. And I think that's really an important strength of a registry, that you can sort of figure out all that stuff. Insurance and formularies, of course, are going to affect things. Nobody's mentioned advertising and detailing today. It just sort of crept by without being noticed. I think it would be really interesting if in any way we can track what's going on and how it's going to affect things. I'm waiting for the commercials to come out with, you know, people romping through the fields and looking good, and the voice in the background talking about all the things, bad things that can happen for the biosimilars. And one thing that I would always like to put into an analysis would be a couple of background variables that we're saying, okay, during this period of time, this particular set of commercials was rolling, this particular incentive program was going on. How did that affect what was happening? Clearly, the price, the copays, the deductibles, we'd like to know that from the perspective of the patient. What were they looking at? What was also what were characteristics of their insurer and what have you. And then just for the fun of it, We have one other thing coming along here as the biosimilars roll out. We have CMS is about to change the way that it pays physicians. It's bringing in the macro system and the MIPS, and these things start in 2017. Basically, as a physician, you could either get dinged or get a bit more money if you play along nicely and report all sorts of appropriate data to CMS so they can see whether or not you're practicing medicine sort of the way they think you ought to be doing it. And this is going to have certainly an effect upon physicians in terms of the one more kind of pressure that they're going to be under and one more step that they're going to have to go through in the prescribing process. And as this system rolls out and it becomes a little tougher, probably a little more complicated, we sort of want to track over time how that's happening. And so the proportion of Medicare and non-Medicare patients in the population of a particular practice is going to end up, I think, being something that we want to keep an eye on. Oops. Okay, let's talk a little bit about quality of life. There are a whole bunch of systems out there that we use to measure the quality of life of individuals. There are a bunch of different questionnaires. I'll show you an example or two in a moment. There's the EQ5D, which the Uricol. It comes in a couple of different flavors. There's the HAC. There's the Huey 2 and the Huey 3. There's the SF36, and there's the QWB, the Quality of Well-Being Index. And all of these are more or less sensitive and more or less specific to arthritis, and they yield different scores. And so it's important, if you do cost-effectiveness analysis, to have a consistent measure, because if one researcher is using one system and one's using another, you're going to get different results. We also want to keep track of price and cost information. We want to know who benefits or might be motivated by price changes. Is the benefit going to be to the physicians? If it's an infused drug under Part B, you can make a bit of money on the difference between what the acquisition cost of the drug and what Medicare will pay you. Is it going to be the patients who benefit from changes in biosimilar prices in the forms of lower out-of-pocket payments? Are the insurers the ones who are going to be doing better? We want to really understand where the effects of biosimilars on prices are going to occur. And we also want to know if somehow or other these changes in drug prices are going to affect what we call direct and indirect costs. Direct costs are all the things that you pay for all the medical stuff. And then the indirect costs are things like lost work, disability payments, and what have you. To the extent that price changes promote changes in prescribing patterns, there may be some really big downstream effects in terms of what happens. Basically, fewer wheelchairs showing up in a lot of places and more people staying at work. Okay, so the nice thing about Corona data, this isn't going to sound like a commercial, of course, right? The nice thing about Corona data, it's okay? All right, all right. So you're able to track here what is happening as the thing rolls forward. We'll be able to track the uptake of the biosimilars. We will be able to track what I'll call the market share within Corona. That is, what percentage of the drugs are biosimilars as opposed to being originators. We're going to be able to see the frequency and reasons for switching and substitution. There's in the data that Corona collects, there's quite a bit of detail, both in terms of lab test results and in terms of reports by the physician and some comments by the patient about what was going on. What were the different perspectives on what happened? Were there adverse events? Was there a loss of response? There are even some questions, I'll show them in a moment, which would suggest that there may have been economic considerations on the part of the patient. Please, doctor, let me have this rather than that. And there's also in the Corona this interesting combination of academic practices and private practices. And so to the extent that there are different styles of doing medicine, we can sort of tease those out across the different elements of the data. What the Corona data will do is they will give us parameters for modeling a longer-term cost effectiveness and cost utility, and we will want to do this from different perspectives. The societal perspective, which is the one that the economists love, is to try to take into account all of the costs that occur in society, regardless of who's paying for them, all of the benefits, regardless of who's getting the benefit. You can also narrow the perspective down. You can just look at things from the viewpoint of the payer, or you can look at it simply from the viewpoint of the patient perspective. But it's important that you establish what is the perspective that you want to use in any given study. The thing that Corona asks the patient, there are questions in the current in the current question bank about their awareness of biologics, their perceptions of the safety of biologics, perceptions of efficacy, costs compared to originator drugs, co-pays that they have for originator drugs and biosimilars, and then what kind of hassles did you have with your insurance company in getting approval for either the biologic, for either the originator or the biosimilar. I think all of this gives very rich contextual information to figure out what's going on as biosimilars roll out. Now, the thing that is frequently done in cost effectiveness analysis is that we're trying to make projections into the future about how things are going to play out. Randomized clinical trials only last for a certain period of time, and then they end, and you have some information on how things are going to work out. But often what you want to know is over the lifetime of the individual, how is a particular scenario going to work itself out? And what will be the effect of various changes in the system. So in simulation modeling, what you usually do, and this is all done in the world of computers spinning away, you follow hypothetical patients. You set up a 10,000 hypothetical cases by age, sex, maybe initial clinical condition, other things that you think are relevant, and you start them off at the beginning of their arthritis treatment, and you may follow them through for many years or to the end of life. And it may be 15 years, 30 years, whatever, to see what's going on. In that kind of model, you incorporate what you know about the probability of switching drugs due to insufficient response, adverse events, or whatever. So you have these patients, and they're walking through either a decision tree or some model where you have an idea that after 6 months something's going to require, a particular drug is going to require an increase in dosage in order to remain effective. Or it's going to start winding down in terms of its effectiveness, and at that point there's an X% probability that people will start switching over to something else. You also want to incorporate the probability of what the changes will be. Will they be changes in the DAS-28 score? Will they be changes in various other clinical measures? And you'd like that to be for specific drugs if you have that information. And gradually, as you work through the databases that are coming along, we'll begin to have that information. We had some hints of that in the Northwich study in the slides that we saw earlier today. Given, as you go through that, we then estimate what kinds of changes there would be in the quality of life, given what we know about or are guessing about the changes in the clinical measures. And so there's eventually a translation process that occurs where you go from the clinical measures to the quality of life. And that is based upon what you've already gotten from databases such as Corona, where you've collected both the clinical information and you've used the quality of life instruments so that you have an idea how these two things match up. And then in the simulation modeling, you can use that information to project what's going to happen over the future. And with that, you then plug in all the economic stuff, and you can estimate changes in direct costs. What you usually need at this point is to link the data set with claims data, so that you have some idea of what are the expenses that a person with arthritis has in terms of their experience with hospitalizations, visits to physicians, what have you, use of durable medical equipment, all that stuff. And the claims data, therefore, merged with your other data, such as from a registry, gives you a more complete picture of what's going on. You often have to also build in there a few things like the prices that you know Medicare is paying or that Medicaid is paying or what have you, and of course the information you're getting from the patients. So all that goes into building a simulation model which is going to track over time the experience of this cohort of 10,000 or so hypothetical patients. And I just said that. Corona gives us all these things that we can look at, especially when it's married with claims data, which does go on. Corona has been doing that already. Some of the key modeling issues that you'd want to work out: what % of patients on originator drugs switch over? What % of naive patients start with a biosimilar? How much back and forth switching is there? And all this stuff about response duration and discontinuation. Those are things that you have to build into the model, and then you can play around with your assumptions to see how much things are going to be changing. The magic formula did appear, finally. So the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, as I said, is the difference in cost relative to the difference in some effects. And this is the sort of the key measure, the ICER, which is what is used in most studies of cost effectiveness or cost utility. And there it is again. So I'm going to focus, didn't that work well? First, a few things about the effects measure, that is the denominator of the ICER. And as I said before, we usually measure things in terms of quality adjusted life years. And the idea is to get things measured on a scale where 1 is perfect health, 0 is death, everything else is in between, and you do allow for the possibility that you could have negative conditions which people would consider to be a state worse than death. There are various survey instruments that you ask patients about their health, and then their answers are converted into this QALY score, which is based upon a very large survey that was done in a population where you presented the people in the population with hypothetical cases. What if you looked like this? What if you looked like that in terms of how much pain you're in or mobility problems or what have you? The responders to the survey sort of give it a number, and then that establishes what's called the tariff, which is the numbers that you use to apply to what you got out of the QALY instrument to convert it all to a final quality of life score. And we typically go off and try to ask a large representative sample of the population, how do you think about this? Sometimes you go off and you ask patients themselves what they think about this, but their perceptions, of course, are a bit different. And the perception here is that quality adjusted life years, you sort of want a societal perspective on this. There are a number of these different instruments, and they're more or less specific about exactly what they say in terms of the information that they collect about arthritis and mobility problems. The HAQ, the last one down there, the Health Assessment Questionnaire Disability Index for arthritis is the most specific, but it doesn't ask all of the things about life that some of the other instruments do. There's general agreement with these various quality survey instruments that life with arthritis is worse. That life with arthritis is worse than without arthritis. But after that, they differ somewhat in terms of the exact numbers that they give to the quality of life measurement. And so the takeaway message here is that when we start doing these comparisons, we really do want to be doing them with the same instrument, or we have to have a way of translating among them. This is a study that was done a few years ago, 2011, Kahana, Robert Kaplan, and others, where they actually asked the same people all of these questions. Some of the population did not have arthritis, the other half did, and they sat them down and they asked each one of them to answer these questions the same way. So what you see here is the red lines are the responses from people who had arthritis. The blues are the ones that don't. What you see here is that each one of the instruments does say having arthritis is worse than just being in the general population without arthritis. But you notice that the levels that are reported by these different instruments are different. The EQ5D, which is beloved of the European Union and Great Britain, tends to give rather higher numbers to quality of life than do some of the instruments that get a little deeper into the weeds in terms of asking you about how you feel in terms of arthritis. And so, once again, it's important that we be sure what it is that we want to use. So I've said that the things that go on in the EQ5D, it's a very simple questionnaire thing. You ask the patient about their ability to move around, mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain and discomfort, anxiety and depression, and this is the version that asks it on a 5-point scale. This is the latest version. And so basically on mobility, I have no problems in walking about, some slight problem, moderate problem, severe problem, I'm unable to walk about, and so on these other things. Now the problem with this for doing studies of arthritis is you could have quite a bit of improvement that a person could have, and you might not necessarily move in terms of the box you check. And so this is where there's a danger of these instruments not being quite sensitive enough, or conversely, maybe a one-box jump is maybe a little bit more than you should have. So we're going to have to be sort of careful in the way that we work with these things. Okay, I've said that. The hack is another instrument. It is a little more, this was basically set up for arthritis, and it asks you about your ability to do dressing and grooming, getting up and down, eating, walking, how well you can reach for things, your grip strength activities, and what have you. So we're getting a little more into true arthritis issues. Corrona has in it a very specific form of the hack that gives a lot more detail. And again, the answers end up being, can you do these various things without any difficulty, some difficulty, much difficulty, you're unable to do them. Oops, okay. There's been some work at crosswalking between these two systems so that we can convert from the hack score to the quality of life score in the EQ5D. This work is going on, and it gets into the deep weeds of statistical estimation, and I know you'd all like me to go into this a bit more, but I won't. I think we're going to eventually see a new generation of quality adjustment life things coming along. All of these quality instruments right now are based upon classic methods of questioning. Basically, you ask everybody every question. And gradually, we're developing new instruments that are based upon item response theory. And some of you may be young enough to have taken the graduate record exam or the SAT score or the SAT at a computer, where the computer asks you a question, maybe a math question, and if you answer it right, then it moves you on automatically to another question, which is harder enough to indicate that you know this, that, or the other thing. And if you flunk the question, then they ask you an easy question to figure out just how dumb you are in terms of your math. That kind of targeted questioning can give you a lot of information about just how good or how bad somebody's quality of life is. We don't have instruments like that right now. They are gradually being developed, and I think they'll be very helpful. NIH has been working on its PROMISE system, where it's going out and asking, developing this kinds of questioning method, and I think we'll eventually move into a new generation that is very sensitive to quality of life issues. Let's see, here we are again, and now a few things about cost. I want to spend just a minute or two talking about a paper that Jeff Curtis, Joel, you were not, yes, Joel, and some of my other colleagues at UAB have worked on, where they were working with Corona data married to claims data, and they were looking at clinical status and economic savings associated with the remission among people with arthritis. So they had Corona data. They were able to link it to Medicare data to establish some people in Medicare who really had arthritis. They were able to measure disease activity using the Clinical Disease Activity Index. And they were able to track through claims data all of the hospitalizations, some measures of hospitalization and emergency department visits, mortality information, and medical costs. So claims data are wonderful in the sense that if you're somebody like a Medicare patient, you can be sort of followed through all aspects of your life, but claims data don't have much clinical detail in them, and so the marriage with Corona was very helpful. They estimated some Cox proportional hazard models looking at disease activity and outcomes, and they grouped people into different categories based upon some phenotypes. What they found was that in the particular data set that they were working with, they had 4,593 unique arthritis patients, and these people were around for about 3 years on average, so they had 12,000 or so person years of information to follow. They found a dose-response relationship between arthritis activity, that is, you're in remission or you're in low, moderate, or high arthritis, and the incidence of hospitalizations. Surprise! People who are in really bad shape with their arthritis are in the hospital more. And people who are, people who are in remission are in the hospital a lot less. Good news, but not a surprise, but you really would like to understand what is the implication of this. If we do a better job treating the disease, there are significant downstream savings. All of the adjusted hazard ratios were significant, relating disease activity, and they found similar trends for emergency department visits and mortality. There was some cost savings here. The incremental cost savings associated with being in remission was $11,145. So if you were in moderate disease activity, it was going to cost $17,646. Let's see. That's the cost savings associated to being in remission compared to being in a moderate disease situation. I'm sorry, I'm misreading the slide. If you were if you were in remission, your costs were $11,145. If you were in moderate disease activity, your costs were $17,646. And then so we have here a crude savings of $6,501. And after they did some adjustments with some various covariates and regression analysis, that came down to $3,133. So this is the good news. The bad news is that, as they say, in purely economic terms, if a patient required a biologic to move from moderate disease activity to remission, the lower medical cost associated with being in remission would not be offset by the high cost currently of biologic therapy, which is typically about $30,000 a year. And so while the things are looking good clinically for the biologics, we can hope that the biosimilars are going to move those numbers a little bit, and actually what we're going to end up paying for the biosimilars will pay for or let us earn a social profit on the cost of treatment. And so that's basically what's going on here. So in the future, we could go off and do similar analyses where we would be able to contrast originator drugs and biosimilars and see what the effects are of the biosimilars on the cost of RA treatment. And so you can stay tuned for future analyses. I think I'll stop it there.